Look at any photograph.
A portrait, a landscape, a snapshot taken on a phone 5 minutes ago. It doesn't matter which one. Look at it and notice what you feel. The sense that this is real, that this happened, that somewhere, at some specific moment in time, the light in that image actually existed, and the camera simply caught it. We trust photographs in a way we trust almost nothing else. More than paintings, more than written accounts, more than memory itself. A photograph, we feel, cannot lie. It is evidence. It is proof. It is the thing itself, preserved. And yet, almost everything you believe about the invention of photography is wrong. You probably know one name: Louis Daguerre, the Frenchman. The daguerreotype, 1839. The moment a machine first captured an image of the world. Except that is not when photography was invented, and Daguerre, brilliant as he was, did not do it alone. And the invention of photography was not a moment at all. It was a process, slow, contested, international, and built on the forgotten work of people who received almost nothing for what they gave the world. The story of the camera is the story of a question that human beings have been asking for thousands of years. Can we make light remember? The answer, when it finally came, changed everything. Not just how we take pictures, how we see ourselves, how we understand the past, how we experience time, how we grieve and celebrate and prove that things were real. By the end of this, you will see photographs differently, not as windows onto the past, but as something stranger and more human than that. The camera did not begin with chemistry. It began with a hole in a wall. As early as the 5th century BC, the Chinese philosopher Mozi described a phenomenon he had observed. Light, passing through a small hole in a darkened room, would project an inverted image of the world outside onto the opposite wall. The image was upside down, and the colors were correct, and it moved in real time with the scene outside. He could not explain why, but he recorded what he saw. The Arabs knew this phenomenon too. In the 10th century, the scholar Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hazen, wrote the most comprehensive account of optics produced in the ancient or medieval world. His Book of Optics, completed around 1011 AD, described in precise detail how light travels in straight lines, how it behaves when it passes through a small aperture, and how the projected image it creates is geometrically related to the scene outside. He called the device a dark chamber. In Latin, that becomes camera obscura. The camera obscura, a darkened room or box with a small hole or lens that projects an image of the outside world onto an interior surface, was not a 19th century invention. It was a medieval one. By the 16th century, it was a well-known tool used by artists and astronomers across Europe and the Arab world. Artists used it to trace accurate perspective. Giovanni Battista della Porta described it in 1558. Johannes Vermeer almost certainly used one. The extraordinary optical accuracy of his interiors, the precision of the light, the almost photographic quality of his compositions has led many art historians to conclude that he was painting with a camera obscura beneath his brush. Astronomers used it to observe solar eclipses without damaging their eyes. Travelers carried portable versions, folding boxes, darkened tents, to sketch landscapes and record natural scenes with a precision that unaided hand and eye could rarely match. The camera obscura was everywhere for centuries before anyone thought to ask the obvious question: what if the image could stay? The first person to make a permanent image using light was not Louis Daguerre. His name was Joseph Nicephore Niepce, and he was a French inventor who had already done something remarkable before he turned to photography. He had built one of the first internal combustion engines and developed a form of lithographic printing using light-sensitive materials. Niepce was interested, from the early 1810s onward, in the possibility of fixing the image of a camera obscura permanently onto a surface. He called the process he was trying to develop heliography, sun writing. The material he eventually found that could do this was bitumen of Judea, a naturally occurring asphalt that hardens when exposed to light. Niepce coated a pewter plate with a thin layer of bitumen, placed it in a camera obscura aimed at the view from his upper-story window at his estate in Burgundy, and left it for an exposure that lasted, by most estimates, somewhere between 8 hours and several days. The result was an image. Faint, barely readable, the rooftops and courtyard of his estate captured in pale tones on the pewter surface. It was made in approximately 1826 or 1827. The exact date is uncertain because Niepce's records were not always precise. It is the oldest surviving photograph in the world. It is also, by any aesthetic standard, a terrible photograph. The exposure time was so long that the sun moved across the sky during the process, illuminating both sides of the buildings in the scene simultaneously. The image is blurry, indistinct, and almost impossible to read without enhancement. But it existed, a surface that had seen light and remembered it. Niepce spent years trying to improve the process. He experimented with different chemicals, different surfaces, different exposure times. He was a patient, methodical man with a scientific mind and a clear vision of what he was trying to achieve. And then, in 1829, he entered into a partnership with a man who was his temperamental opposite in almost every way. Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre was not a scientist. He was a painter and theatrical designer, the creator of the diorama, a spectacular Paris entertainment in which enormous painted scenes, lit from behind with changing colored lights, created the illusion of movement and transformation. Audiences sat in a rotating auditorium that turned to face one painted scene and then another, while the lighting shifted to suggest sunrise, storms, moonlight, fire. Daguerre was, in the language of his era, a man of spectacle. He understood audiences. He understood the power of the visual. He understood that what people wanted was not just an image, but an experience, something that astonished them, that made them feel they were seeing the world in a new way. He had been experimenting with light-sensitive chemistry since the early 1820s, and when he heard about Niepce's heliography experiments, he reached out. The two men corresponded, and in 1829 they signed a formal partnership agreement to develop the process together. It was not an equal partnership. Niepce was the senior inventor, the one who had achieved the first fixed image. Daguerre was the marketing force, the man with connections and visibility. Niepce was 64 years old and in declining health. Daguerre was 42 and ambitious. 4 years later, in 1833, Niepce died. He died having received almost no public recognition for his foundational work. The history of photography that would be written in the following decade would give Daguerre the credit, the fame, and the money. Niepce's name would appear in footnotes, if at all. After Niepce's death, Daguerre continued experimenting, and then, according to the story he later told, a story that has the convenient quality of legend, a discovery happened by accident. In 1835, Daguerre placed a silver plate that had been exposed in a camera obscura into a cabinet containing various chemicals. When he took it out the next day, The image had developed far more clearly than any he had previously achieved. He eventually traced the effect to mercury vapor from a broken thermometer in the cabinet. Whether this story is entirely true, or whether Daguerre simplified and dramatized the actual process of discovery, is impossible to know now. What is known is that by 1838 or early 1839, he had a process that worked. A silver plate coated with silver iodide, exposed in a camera, developed with mercury vapor, and fixed with salt water. The result was an image of extraordinary clarity and detail, sharp, luminous, and permanent. He called it the daguerreotype. On the 7th of January 1839, the French scientist François Arago announced to the Académie des Sciences in Paris that a new process had been developed which could fix the image of the camera obscura permanently. He did not yet describe the technical details. Those were being kept secret until a formal agreement with the French government could be reached. But the announcement alone was enough.
The reaction was immediate.
And worldwide. Newspapers across Europe and America reported it within days. Scientists began speculating about the chemistry. Artists debated what it meant for painting. The public was astonished, then excited, then desperate to see it. The French government moved quickly. In June 1839, a deal was struck. Daguerre would receive a lifetime pension of 6,000 francs per year, and Niepce's son, Isidore, would receive 4,000. In exchange, the process would be made freely available to the world, open, unpatented, a gift from France to humanity. On the 19th of August, 1839, Arago presented the full technical details of the daguerreotype process at a joint session of the Académie des Sciences and the Académie des Beaux-Arts. The crowd that gathered outside the Institut de France that day was enormous. People who could not get inside clustered in the streets, waiting for the description to be read. Optical shops in Paris sold out of silver plates and iodine within hours of the announcement. Within days, people across Europe were attempting to make daguerreotypes of their own. Within weeks, the daguerreotype was being demonstrated in London, New York, Vienna, and Constantinople. The era of photography had begun. But it had not begun with Daguerre alone. While Daguerre was perfecting his silver plate process in Paris, a British scientist named William Henry Fox Talbot was doing something entirely different, and, in the long run, more important. Talbot had begun his experiments in 1834, independently of Daguerre and independently of Niepce. His starting point was different. He was not trying to fix the image of a camera obscura. He was trying to make paper sensitive to light and use it to capture the outlines of objects placed directly on its surface. He called his first results photogenic drawings. He placed leaves, lace, flowers, and other flat objects on paper treated with silver chloride, exposed them to sunlight, and fixed the resulting image with a strong salt solution. The result was a negative, a reversed image in which the object appeared light against a dark background. The process was simple and beautiful. It was also, by the standards of the daguerreotype, imprecise. The paper fibers created a slightly grainy image that lacked the razor sharpness of Daguerre's metal plates. But Talbot noticed something that would prove to be the most important insight in the entire history of photography. His paper negatives could be used to make positive prints. By placing a negative against a fresh sheet of sensitized paper and exposing it to light, Talbot could produce a positive image. Light areas where the original had been light, dark areas where it had been dark, and he could repeat this process as many times as he wanted from the same negative. One negative, infinite prints. This is the principle that governed photography for the next 150 years. Every photograph you have ever held in your hand, every printed image in every newspaper, every magazine, every family album, descended from Talbot's negative-positive process, not from Daguerre's daguerreotype, which produced a unique, unrepeatable image on a metal plate and could not be copied. Talbot's process was the foundation of photography as a medium of mass communication. Daguerre got the fame. Talbot built the future. When Arago announced the daguerreotype in January 1839, Talbot was caught off guard. He rushed to present his own work to the Royal Institution in London, just 3 weeks after Arago's announcement, to establish his own priority. He called his process the calotype. The two processes existed in parallel for more than a decade. The daguerreotype was sharper, more detailed, more immediately impressive. The calotype was reproducible, more practical, more democratic. Eventually, a third process, the wet collodion process, developed in the 1850s, combined some of the advantages of both and effectively replaced them both. But the conceptual architecture Talbot had established, the negative, the positive, the repeatable print, never went away. The immediate impact of photography on daily life was concentrated in one place, the portrait. Before photography, a portrait meant a painting. A painting meant an artist and time and money, significant amounts of all three. A family portrait was a luxury available to the wealthy. A personal likeness was something most people never possessed. Photography changed this almost overnight. Within months of the daguerreotype's announcement, portrait studios began opening across Europe and America. By 1840, there were studios in every major city. By 1850, tens of millions of daguerreotype portraits had been made. By 1860, having your photograph taken was an ordinary, affordable experience for almost any member of the working or middle class in the industrialized world. The carte de visite, a small photographic portrait mounted on a card, introduced in France in the 1850s and popularized by the photographer André-Adolphe Eugène Disdéry, became a social phenomenon unlike anything before it. People collected them. They traded them. Albums of carte de visite filled parlor shelves across Europe. When portraits of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were produced as carte de visite, the demand was so great that the concept of the celebrity photograph was effectively born. But the deeper change was more personal than any celebrity portrait. For the first time in human history, ordinary people could look at the faces of their dead. Before photography, if a parent died, if a child died, if a husband or wife was lost, what remained was memory, imprecise, fading, subject to the distortions of grief and time. There might be a lock of hair, there might be a silhouette, if someone had thought to have one made. There might, if the family was prosperous, be a painting. Now there was a photograph. The practice of post-mortem photography, photographing the dead, often posed as if sleeping or at peace, was common throughout the second half of the 19th century and was not considered morbid. It was considered a final act of love, a last chance to have a likeness. Often it was the only photograph a family would ever have of the person they had lost. Photography did not just record the world. It changed how people related to death. The early daguerreotype had one problem that limited everything it could do. It was slow. The exposure times required in the late 1830s and early 1840s ranged from several minutes to half an hour in full daylight. You could photograph a building, a street, a landscape, anything that stayed still. You could not photograph a person in a natural pose without asking them to sit motionless for several minutes. Their head held in a metal brace, their expression frozen into the particular rigid blankness that characterizes every daguerreotype portrait. Movement was impossible. Spontaneity was impossible. Life, as it was actually lived, was invisible to the camera. This changed, slowly, over the following decades as chemists found faster, light-sensitive materials, faster plates, faster lenses, shorter exposure times. By the 1860s, exposure times had fallen to seconds. By the 1870s, to fractions of a second. And with that acceleration came a question that had never before been possible to ask. What does the world look like in a fraction of a second? The man who first answered that question was an English photographer working in California, and the question he was trying to answer was, on the surface, absurdly specific. When a horse gallops, is there ever a moment when all four hooves are off the ground at once? His name was Edward Muybridge. Leland Stanford, the railroad magnate, the founder of Stanford University, believed the answer was yes. His trainer believed the answer was no. The debate was serious enough that Stanford commissioned Muybridge to resolve it, at whatever cost was necessary. In 1877 and 1878, at Stanford's Sacramento racetrack, Muybridge set up a series of cameras along the track, their shutters triggered by tripwires that the horse would break as it galloped past. The resulting sequence of images, 12 photographs, taken in less than half a second, showed conclusively that yes, there was a moment of suspension when all four hooves left the ground. But the images showed something else too. The horse in full gallop looked nothing like the horses in paintings. Artists had always depicted galloping horses with their legs extended fore and aft in what is called the rocking horse position. Front legs forward, back legs back, all four legs off the ground simultaneously. Muybridge's photographs showed that this never happened. The actual positions of a galloping horse's legs were nothing like what any artist had ever painted. The camera had revealed that human visual perception, for centuries, had been systematically wrong about one of the most familiar sights in the world. Muybridge went on to photograph hundreds of subjects in motion, humans, animals, birds, producing a vast library of images that became foundational references for artists, anatomists, and eventually filmmakers. His later device, the zoopraxiscope, projected his sequences as moving images, one of the first motion picture projectors. The camera was no longer just recording the world, it was revealing things about the world that the unaided eye could never see. For the first 40 years of its existence, photography remained a technically demanding, chemically complex, professionally specialized activity. Making a photograph required knowledge of chemistry, a darkroom, expensive equipment, and significant skill. The democratization of the portrait was real. You could have your picture taken cheaply, but taking pictures yourself was something most people could not do. George Eastman changed this. Eastman was born in 1854 in Waterville, New York, the son of a bookkeeper who died when George was 7, leaving the family in difficult financial circumstances. He left school at 13 to work and spent his early career as a bank clerk. Organized, systematic, with a talent for process and procedure that would define everything he built. He became interested in photography in his mid-20s, in the late 1870s. At the time, the dominant process was the wet collodion method, a process that required coating a glass plate with a light-sensitive chemical solution, exposing it while still wet, and developing it immediately before it dried. This meant photographers had to carry darkrooms with them, tents, wagons, entire mobile laboratories, whenever they wanted to work outdoors. Eastman found this absurd. He wanted photography that was simple, photography that could be taken anywhere by anyone without chemical expertise or cumbersome equipment. He began experimenting with dry gelatin emulsions, stable coatings that could be applied to a plate in advance, allowed to dry, stored, and developed later. Others had worked on this before him. Eastman refined the formulation, mechanized the manufacturing, and by 1880 was producing dry gelatin plates commercially. But dry plates were still glass, heavy, fragile, expensive, and limiting. Eastman's next step was to find something lighter. He experimented with paper as a base, coating it with gelatin emulsion. Then, in collaboration with a camera inventor named William Walker, he developed a roll of paper film that could be loaded into a camera and advanced after each exposure, replacing the need to change plates one at a time. And then he went further. In 1888, building on the work of other inventors, including the Reverend Hannibal Goodwin, Eastman produced a flexible, transparent film base made from nitrocellulose, celluloid, that was light, tough, and capable of holding a photographic emulsion uniformly. The same year, he launched a camera designed around this film. It was small, it was light, it came preloaded with film for 100 exposures, and it cost $25, significant but within reach of a middle-class American family. It came with a promise that changed everything. When the roll was finished, the user mailed the entire camera back to Eastman's factory in Rochester, New York. The company would develop the film, print the photographs, reload the camera with fresh film, and return everything to the customer. You press the button, we do the rest. The camera was called the Kodak. The word meant nothing. Eastman chose it because it was short, impossible to mispronounce in any language, and unlike any other word in any dictionary. The Kodak was not the first camera. It was not the best camera by technical standards, but it was the first camera that required nothing of the person holding it except the decision to press a button. Photography had been professional, then commercial, then affordable. Now it was personal. Within a few years of the Kodak's launch, amateur photography was one of the fastest-growing activities in the industrialized world. Kodak cameras appeared at picnics, at weddings, at holidays, at the births and deaths, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that had previously passed unrecorded and therefore unremembered. The family photograph album was born. And here is where the story becomes complicated. Because at exactly the moment when photography was becoming universal, when everyone could take pictures, when everyone could preserve their memories, the photograph began to show its limitations as a record of truth. The first war to be extensively photographed was the American Civil War. Photographers like Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner documented the battlefields, the camps, the dead. Their images were shown in galleries, published in newspapers, seen by millions of people who had never been anywhere near a battlefield and who received these photographs as documentary evidence of what the war actually looked like. What they did not know was that some of those photographs had been staged. Gardner's famous image, the home of a rebel sharpshooter, Gettysburg, a dead Confederate soldier lying in a stone-walled enclosure, his rifle propped beside him, was staged. The body had been moved from where it actually fell. The rifle had been placed by the photographers. The scene was arranged for visual impact. This was not considered scandalous at the time. The manipulation was not hidden. It simply was not mentioned. Photographs were presented as documents, and audiences received them as documents, and the gap between the two was invisible. The camera had always told a partial truth. From the very beginning, every photograph was the product of decisions: where to point, when to press the button, what to include and what to exclude, how to light the subject, how to develop the image. The photograph was never the thing itself. It was always an interpretation, a selection.
But it looked like truth.
And that appearance was, and remains, deeply convincing. This tension between the photographer's document and the photographer's interpretation has never been fully resolved. It runs through the entire history of photojournalism. Through the debate over photo manipulation in the digital age, through the question of what AI-generated images mean for a world that has trusted photographs for nearly 200 years. We are still, all of us, living inside the problem that the camera created. For the first 100 years of photography, the world existed in black and white. Not because the world was black and white, but because no one had found a way to make light-sensitive materials respond differently to different wavelengths of light. Silver compounds darkened in proportion to the intensity of light striking them, but they could not distinguish red from green from blue. Everything was rendered as a shade of grey. The first person to produce a true color photograph was not a photographer. He was a physicist, James Clerk Maxwell, the same James Clerk Maxwell who had unified electricity, magnetism, and light in his equations, demonstrated the principle of color photography in 1861. His method used 3 separate black and white photographs taken through red, green, and blue filters. When the 3 images were projected simultaneously through the same colored filters and superimposed on a screen, the result was a color image. The theory was correct. The chemistry was not yet good enough. The photographic materials available in 1861 were not sensitive to red light. So, Maxwell's demonstration worked better than it should have, by a coincidence of chemistry he didn't fully understand. But the principle that color could be captured and reproduced by combining 3 primary color images was exactly right.
Practical color photography
Came much later. The autochrome Lumiere process, developed by Auguste and Louis Lumiere and introduced in 1907, was the first commercially successful color photographic process. It used a layer of dyed potato starch grains to act as color filters, producing images with a soft, slightly grainy color quality that feels, to modern eyes, somewhere between a photograph and a painting. Autochromes are extraordinarily beautiful. They show the world of the early 20th century in color for the first time, a world that in black and white photographs had always looked slightly distant, slightly historical. In the warm colors of an autochrome, the people of 1910 suddenly look like us. Kodachrome, the film that defined color photography for most of the 20th century, was introduced by Eastman Kodak in 1935. Its color accuracy, stability, and richness were unlike anything that had come before. Paul Simon wrote a song about it. It became, for millions of people around the world, the medium in which childhood was preserved, in which holidays existed, in which the color of a grandmother's kitchen or a father's car remained accessible for decades after the original was gone. Kodachrome was discontinued in 2010. The last roll was processed in 2011. In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer at Eastman Kodak named Stephen Sasson built something in his laboratory that his employer would spend the next 25 years trying not to think about. He built a digital camera. It weighed nearly 4 kilograms. It took 0.01 megapixel images of such low resolution that they were barely recognizable. It recorded to a cassette tape and required a special display to view the result. The process of taking a single photograph and displaying it took 23 seconds. When Sasson demonstrated it to Kodak management, the response was politely unenthusiastic. The concern was not that digital photography might fail. The concern was that it might succeed. and in succeeding, destroy the film business that was Kodak's entire reason for existing. The technology was shelved. Sassen's patent was filed, but not publicized. Kodak continued to invest primarily in film. Other companies were not so cautious. Sony introduced the first commercially available digital camera in 1981. Canon, Nikon, and others followed through the 1980s and 1990s. By the mid-1990s, consumer digital cameras were available, though expensive. By 2000, they were affordable. By 2005, digital cameras outsold film cameras for the first time. In 2012, Eastman Kodak, the company that had more than any other single entity created the era of popular photography, filed for bankruptcy. The company that invented the digital camera did not survive the digital camera. But the more profound change was not the camera itself. It was what happened when the camera became a phone. The first camera phone was introduced in Japan in 2000. Within a decade, almost every mobile phone in the developed world had a camera. Within 15 years, the cameras in phones had surpassed, in most practical respects, the dedicated cameras that had replaced them. Today, humanity takes more photographs in 2 minutes than were taken in the entire 19th century. More than 1 trillion photographs exist. Most of them will never be printed. Most of them will never be shown to anyone. They sit in cloud storage, unexamined, unshared, accumulating at a rate that no human attention could ever process. We have not just learned to make light remember, we have learned to make it remember everything, and we are beginning to realize we do not know what to do with that. There is a paradox at the heart of the age of digital photography. We have more photographs than ever. We have more images of our lives, our families, our world, than any previous generation could have imagined. And yet, many people report that their memories feel less vivid, less reliable, less present than they did before. There is research that supports this intuition. When people photograph an object or an experience, they often remember it less well than people who do not photograph it. The act of taking the photograph seems to outsource the memory to the device, the brain, sensing that the information is being preserved externally, invests less in encoding it internally. This is sometimes called the photo-taking impairment effect. We photograph instead of remembering. We document instead of experiencing. We create records of moments that we do not, in the moment itself, fully inhabit. Niepce spent days or weeks waiting for light to record a single rooftop. Daguerre's first portraits required subjects to sit perfectly still for minutes at a time. For most of the 19th century, a photograph was a rare and deliberate thing, something you decided to do, prepared for, waited for, treasured when you had it. Now, the average smartphone user takes over 1,000 photographs a year. Most of them will be glanced at once, if at all. Almost none of them will be printed. A few will be posted to social media and seen by dozens or hundreds of people for a few seconds before the next image appears. The rarity that made the photograph precious has been replaced by an abundance that makes it invisible. And yet, somewhere in that abundance, there are still photographs that stop you. A face, a moment, a quality of light in a specific room on a specific afternoon. And when you find one of those, the feeling is exactly what it was in 1839, when people crowded around a daguerreotype and looked at a fixed image of the world for the first time. The recognition, the astonishment, the sense that light, somehow, remembered. Let me tell you what a camera actually is. Not the device, the lens, the sensor, the shutter, the software. Those are engineering. What the camera actually is as a cultural object, as a human tool, is something more specific. A camera is a machine for fighting time. Human beings have always known that time moves in one direction, that the present becomes the past, that faces change and fade and eventually disappear, that the moment you are in right now, this exact configuration of light and color and presence will not exist again. The candle burns down, the child grows, the person in the room eventually leaves the room forever. Photography was the first technology that could stop time. Not actually, the moment still passed, the people still aged and died. But an image of the moment could be preserved, exactly, and looked at again 50 years later by people who were not alive when it was taken. This is what Niepce was actually doing when he coated that pewter plate and left it in a camera obscura for 8 hours in 1826. He was not just making a picture of a rooftop. He was testing whether it was possible for the present to survive into the future. It was. That rooftop exists now in a museum in Texas. It has existed on that plate for nearly 200 years. Everyone who lived in that house, everyone who walked those streets, is gone. But the light that fell on those stones on that particular morning in Burgundy is still there, fixed in bitumen of Judea on a piece of pewter, making its argument that the present, once it happens, cannot be entirely taken away. The camera is wrong about many things. It frames and selects and distorts. It is manipulated and staged and edited. It flattens 3 dimensions into 2 and drains color from the world and freezes motion into stillness.
But it is right about one thing.
The light was real. Whatever else the photograph may be, document or interpretation, truth or lie, memory or substitute for memory, the light in it actually existed. Some photon of actual sunlight or lamplight, or the light reflected from an actual human face, traveled through a lens and landed on a surface and left a mark. That mark is what you hold when you hold a photograph. We have been trying to hold light since Mozzi noticed the hole in the wall in the 5th century BC. We have been trying to make it remember since Niepce coated his pewter plate. We have been living inside the result since Daguerre made it available to the world in 1839. And now, in a time when 1 trillion photographs exist, and most of them will never be looked at, the question is not whether light can remember, it is whether we can.